Thank you very much. This is Victor Gao from Beijing, and thank you for all the other panelists who have spoken before me. It's really very enlightening. Allow me to make several brief points. First of all, as a general point, in time of war, truth is the first victim, and this applies to all wars everywhere in the world. And then when you talk about war, then deception is inherent in war, rather than truth is inherent in war. Truth is shrouded in mystery, which is shrouded in another enigma. So you really need to unwrap all these different layers of deceptions to really get to the core of truth, if there is any. Now, when you talk about cognitive war, if we assume this is the right term, then I would say in time of war, cognitive war is part of the war. It plays a supportive role, and it is very much dependent on the war itself. Sometimes it moves a couple of steps ahead of the war itself, but it is very much interrelated to war as it is. Then I would say cognitive war in today's world is too blunt a term. Nobody wants to say, I'm engaged in cognitive war, even if that country or that government is indeed engaged in cognitive war. I think in Western countries, cognitive war probably will be projected more gently as media, public relations, and public education, for example, or awareness of the war, etc., or sometimes accusations against other countries, you name it. But few countries, if any, would publicly acknowledge I'm engaged in cognitive war at all. Now, when we come back to this Ukrainian war or military operation in Ukraine, the first question I think we need to really understand is who is fighting against whom in Ukraine. On the surface, it is Russia against Ukraine, but the reality is that it is Russia against Ukraine plus the United States and NATO member states behind Ukraine. So in this sense, you follow this definition, then you will know that these countries are purely divided into two camps of combatants against each other. On the one hand, you have Russia. On the other hand, you have Ukraine in the front as the fodder, for example, for all those countries behind Ukraine, the United States in particular, and all the other NATO member states. Now, the other question you need to understand is whether NATO is a one single bloc, for example, or whether members of NATO's are really following very different agendas, and they answer to the constituents of their own country. In this way, you will know the cognitive war or public media blitz, whatever term you use, will be different from one country versus other. So if you listen to whatever that comes out of Moscow or Russia in general, it's very, very different from whatever that comes out from the United States. But if you listen very carefully to what's coming out from France versus Germany versus, let's say, Poland or the three Baltic states, etc., they are very different, even though they are all NATO member states. So I would say in this Ukrainian situation, there is no single cognitive war at all. It applies to different countries. It applies to different NATO members, etc. Now, if you look beyond this big circle involving Russia on the one hand, United States and all the other NATO member states, and then plus all the other non-NATO members, which happen to be OECD countries, which firmly support the sanctions and condemnation of Russia, etc., then you see, another kind of repercussions in terms of the cognitive war or public media blitz against Russia, for example, very, very different. So I think we need to analyze each strand and each ripple differently and separately before we can really understand what we are talking about in terms of the cognitive war. Now then, if you look at a larger scope of the matter, then you come to those countries which are not joining in the sanctions against Russia, or those countries which are more sympathetic to Russia as a country, to the Russians as a nation, for example, which do not want to condemn Russian civilization or great Russian stars like Tchaikovsky or Tolstoy, you name it. So many of these Russians who have contributed to the mankind civilization. So I would say when we talk about cognitive war, we really need to understand what we are talking about. And then if you allow me to use the United States as an example, there is no one single cognitive war coming out of the United States because there are so many different walks of life, so many different opinion leaders, so many different news media, for example, and scholars. So we need to really look at the United States in greater depth to understand what exactly is going on. However, if you really read the situation in the United States a little bit better, then you will know that if the United States has or is approaching to declaring that Russia is an enemy state, which I think more or less it has done so already in this war in Ukraine, then regardless of which media agency you are coming from, or which university you are teaching, for example, you will be literally barred from making some utterances because you really do not want to be accused of siding with your enemy state, for example, regardless of what's going on in your mind or what's going on in your heart. So I think that is the cruel reality. It doesn't matter whether you are in a democracy, whatever you define it, or in a non-democracy state. In times of war, there will be much more restricted freedom of speech or freedom of research or making your own opinion known, because you are not allowed to do that at the risk of, for example, being accused of as a sympathizer or a supporter of the enemy state. Now, allow me to pull back a little bit from this war in Ukraine. Let me ask you several hypothetical questions. Now, if you ask Japan as a country or as a nation that assume there will be no consequences, use all your imagination and come up with an accusation of a crime against humanity or war crime or genocide. You ask Japan in all privacy, you say, emphasize to them, there will be no consequences. Just use all your imagination. Do your independent research. Come to your own conclusion. You will not be surprised if, for example, after all the hesitations, they will say, well, the 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki do constitute as crimes against humanity, as genocide, as war crimes. On the other hand, in the world of practicality of today, do you think any country will allow Japan to make such accusation? Or if they make that accusation, do you think such accusation will stand? Or they will be accepted as general truth? No. Why? Because there will be consequences. The United States will never allow Japan to make such accusations, regardless of the merits of the case involving Nagasaki or Hiroshima. So that is one example. Allow me to make another hypothetical question. Use all your imagination and say, do you think England will launch a war against Scotland? You will say, it's crazy. No, it's the United Kingdom. It's a democracy. How can you expect that England will launch a war against Scotland? But if you ask them a little bit deeper, you say, okay, what about after the independence of Scotland? You may say, no, there will be no such possibility. England will never launch a war against Scotland. But let me say to you, very eloquently, if I use that term, England will launch a war against Scotland. If, for example, a country like Russia wants to deploy nuclear weapons in Scotland, then you may say, this will never happen. How can Scotland allow a country like Russia or any other country to deploy missiles or nuclear nuclear warheads in Scotland. But use all your imagination. And I can assure you, if any country really wants to deploy missiles in Scotland, which may be construed as constituting a survival threat to England itself, England will raise arms against Scotland and will prevent such deployment from becoming the truth. Therefore, when we look at the world as today, don't be fooled that any country, independent or non-independent country, has the full independence to do whatever it wants. It cannot. Scotland cannot allow foreign countries to base nuclear weapons in Scotland. Why? Because England will not allow that to happen. I would say, I would make several points. If we listen to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and if the world gives him all that he has asked for, do you know what will happen? We will be in the middle of a third world war. Now, let me say something about the United Nations. I used to work with the United Nations Secretariat in New York. My wife is a permanent staff member of the United Nations. So I completely disagree with President Zelensky when he called for dissolution of the United Nations or closing of the United Nations Security Council or expelling Russia from the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Why? Because if we look at the United Nations since 1945, the United Nations has made one great, unbelievable achievement. That is, despite of the war in Ukraine, as we are going through right now, the world has prevented another world war since 1945. This is exactly the reason and the raison d'etre of the United Nations, because without the United Nations, I probably think there would have been 2 or 3 other world wars since 1945. So I hope President Zelensky will be grateful that he's still alive, not being engulfed in another world war in the decades after 1945 and before today. We as mankind need to be grateful to the existence of the United Nations, especially of the checks and balances of the United Nations Security Council. Why Russia still sits on the United Nations Security Council? Because its predecessor, the former Soviet Union, really contributed in blood and sweat and lives for defeating Nazi Germany, as well as imperialist Japan, and all the other UN Security Council permanent members did the same, because otherwise we are not living in the world order that we are living in right now. Now, the other one is that, very quickly, I use the example of England invading Scotland, which is completely hypothetical. It will never happen. However, when we look at the war in Ukraine, don't tell me that NATO did not have anything to blame. Why? Because realistically, listen to Dr. Henry Kissinger. He said a country like Ukraine should never expect to join NATO, or NATO should never give any realistic expectation to Ukraine to become a NATO member. Who has closed the door to Ukraine membership of NATO? I don't think the United States or NATO members have done so. And I do hope they will reflect that when they want to expand NATO for whatever reason, they should watch out for major toes that they do not want to step on. And this is exactly why I used the England invading Scotland as an example. If any country wants to deploy missiles in Scotland, it will lead to a war between Scotland and England. God forbid, this will never happen. Now, in the cognitive war or in the media blitz, for example, now nobody talks NATO having any fault in the war in Ukraine at all. Why? In the West, this is taboo. You cannot even talk about this. However, when the dust does settle eventually, you will realize that NATO has some problem because of continued expansion of NATO. Let me use another example. Do you know, or do you think you will be shocked that a country like Mongolia, just to China's north and sandwiched between Russia and China, is an observer state of NATO. Every year, NATO conducts military exercises in Mongolia, sometimes along China-Mongolia border, sometimes along Mongolian-Russian border. Do you think this is legitimate interest of NATO? Mongolia is probably as far away from NATO as possible, from the Atlantic as possible. So you need to ask yourself, is this stabilizing peace and stability or destabilizing peace and stability? So don't tell me anyone is an angel in this war in Ukraine. And when you talk about the cognitive war, this is exactly why, for example, a country like Russia is talking about NATO, and why NATO is keeping its mouth completely shut up, as if it is the angel for this war in Ukraine. Final point, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, bring the war to an end as quickly as possible is the only right choice. And achieving neutrality for Ukraine is the only right choice for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. Thank you.